Okay, the second book I brought with me is a biography of Beethoven, the universal composer. It's by Edmund Morris, whom you might have heard of for a biography he wrote of Ronald Reagan. And I think maybe at first you might wonder why I'm reading a biography of Beethoven if I'm supposed to be talking about science. But this book actually delves a lot into his psychology, the psychology, I guess you would say, of art, genius in composing, and also the mathematics of composing. For 40 hours, the snow tumbled over New England, settling up to 6 feet deep on every city, forest, and frozen river. At the blizzard's height on Tuesday, February 7th, 1978, President Carter declared coastal Massachusetts a federal disaster area. After a second record night of snow, the governor ordered all citizens not engaged in relief work to stay home. Interstate 93 ran white as a glacier, its ramps curving into the moraine of downtown Boston. Just when the world seemed about to suffocate, the last flakes fell. But then the snow turned to ice, and the weight of precipitation became unbearable. Power grids snapped, hospitals switched to emergency supplies, stores and restaurants stayed dark. Biographical researchers, trapped in digs near Harvard University, found themselves with nothing to eat and nowhere to buy food. Another night of almost total silence came on. It was difficult not to think of entombment. Thursday morning brought sunshine and a sense of life returning. Icicles sliced the light. The first shovelers got to work in front of dorm doorways. Students on skis poled across Harvard Yard. Pedestrians struggled to follow, plunging waist-deep at every step. There was still little noise, only the dry squeak of snow underfoot and an occasional shout. Then some invisible person threw open a second-floor window, mounted a pair of speakers on the sill, and blasted the finale of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony into the crisp air. Nothing was ever so loud, so bright as that C major fanfare, surging over a blare of trombones with all the force of Old Faithful. It was Carlos Kleiber's recording with the Vienna Philharmonic, new then, legendary now. Skiers, shovelers, and plungers stood transfixed. After 3 great leaps, the last requiring an extra beat to discharge all of its sound, the chords subsided, only to gather strength for higher and higher ascents to the crest of the scale and beyond, until, geyser-like, they broke into exultic syncopations. So far, nobody had heard a melody, or any harmonies that could not be blown through a mouth organ. And when a tune finally came, played at maximum volume by 3 horns, it was close to banal. So why, after the music ended 10 minutes later, with 48 thunderous claps of C major, were some of the listeners crying? Of all the great composers, Beethoven is the most enduring in his appeal to dilettantes and intellectuals alike. Bach and Mozart have had their periods of misapprehension, the former mocked as passé even in his own lifetime, the latter miniaturized by the Victorians. Handel, in contrast, was giantified, but as the composer of Messiah mainly, at cost to his operatic achievement. Haydn, Beethoven's teacher, is admired more by connoisseurs than by the general public. Schubert was still being caricatured as an idiot savant long after World War II. Brahms has never gone down well in France. Bruckner is a minority taste outside of the German-speaking world. And Sibelius, who once seemed sure of a seat on Parnassus, has been replaced by the masturbatory Mahler. Beethoven was recognized in his teens as a genius of the first order. He was less of a prodigy than Mozart or Mendelssohn, but surpassed them in the brightness of his aspirations. From the moment he arrived in Vienna at the age of 21, that city, the capital of the musical world, celebrated him. Princes vied for the honor of putting him up in their palaces. Mozart, just a few years earlier, had to dine below the valets but above the cooks. After Haydn died in 1809, Beethoven, not yet 40, became the world's most famous composer. He remains that almost 2 centuries later. Climb the mildewed stairway of the most obscure building he ever lived in, and you can be fairly sure of bumping into a Welsh choral society or a party of reverent Japanese. What draws them is Beethoven's universality, his ability to embrace the whole range of human emotion, from dread of death to love of life and to the metaphysics beyond, reconciling all doubts and conflicts in a catharsis of sound. That anonymous broadcaster of the finale of the Fifth Symphony across Harvard Yard after the blizzard of '78 knew just where to drop his needle, the point at which the transition from the C minor scherzo resolves fortissimo into C major. He also understood, even if his listeners did not, the symbolism of that transition, the most claustrophobic passage in all of music. It begins with a sudden hush, as if a great weight has blocked out light and air. For a moment, all is frozen shock, the strings holding an indeterminate chord, and then an almost inaudible beating of drums is heard. Stifled moans sound in the violins, terrified, fragmentary phrases that try to rise without success. The drum beats, hesitant at first, become a constant throb as if hysteria is building, while the moans again try to rise. With agonizing difficulty, they begin to succeed, and the weight overhead seems to lighten. Airy woodwinds amplify a gathering crescendo joined by trumpets and horns. Then all restraint is loosened and the whole orchestra breaks free and every hair stands up on your neck. There are countless moments such as this in Beethoven, but not one like this. His originality prevents him from repeating himself. At the same time, there is a signature quality, unmistakable as the hand of Picasso. Radical to begin with, Beethoven grew more radical with age. Some of his late works reinvent themselves movement by movement. The string quartet in B-flat, Opus 130, traverses more styles in 50 minutes than Wagner did in 50 years. And after finishing it with a stupendous fugue, Beethoven still had enough inspiration left over to write an alternative finale, his last published composition, that has the effect of transforming the whole work in retrospect. The other movements still float in order astern, but they look closer and more companionable, seen from a less lofty masthead. That fugue, by the way, known and feared by chamber musicians as the Gross Fugue, a breaker of strings and burner of fingertips, was Igor Stravinsky's favorite quartet movement. There can be no better testimony to Beethoven's timelessness than the fact that Stravinsky, iconoclast supreme, measured his own modernism against something written in 1825, quote, "This absolutely contemporary piece of music that will be contemporary forever. I love it beyond any other." Heard today for the first or 101st time, the Gross Fugue still overwhelms with the sheer brutality of its sound. For more than a quarter of an hour, violins, viola, and cello squawk and scream like frenzied vultures. One can understand the rumors around Vienna that Beethoven, famous for his eccentricity, had at last gone mad. Yet even as audiences recoiled from the fugue, they had to account for the fact that it was paired with a slow cavatina or singing movement of indescribable beauty. If a confused brain produced the one, what all-comprehending heart poured out the other? Contrast and conflict are essential characteristics of Beethoven's art. Throughout his life, he struggled against epic odds and prevailed with enormous courage. The odds were at various times social, sexual, psychotic, and political, but two especially tormented him: ill health and loneliness. His muscularity and ruddy complexion disguised the former, at least when he was young, and the latter was self-inflicted. He fled the palaces of his patrons, preferring to pay his own rent and compose in peace. Domestically helpless, he moved no fewer than 80 times, and lived in prosperous squalor, with history's most notorious pisspot under his grand piano. Yet he was never short of the acolytes and enablers. "Would you like to sleep with my wife?" that eminence attracts. None of them was privy to the full extent of Beethoven's bodily and mental sufferings. Two famous documents, written in secrecy and discovered only after his death, make this clear: the Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802 and the Immortal Beloved letter of 1812. In the former, he revealed, or rather filed away in a secret drawer, the most awful fact that a musician can face, that he was going deaf. He was 31 years old and had long been tormented by buzzing and whistlings in his ears. At first, he hoped they might respond to medicine. When they did not, he had to live with them. By 1808, he could no longer hide his condition. Anyone who heard him conduct or play the piano, desperately pounding the keys, could tell that Beethoven now lived in a sonic world of his own. 10 years later, people wanting to converse with him had to write their remarks on paper. Beethoven's last greatest works were conceived in what George Eliot calls the roar which lies on the other side of silence. His equally anguished love letter, addressed but never mailed to the immortal beloved, has lost none of its poignancy now that Maynard Solomon has revealed the identity of the woman involved. One senses Beethoven's acceptance that flesh was frail and music too insatiable a mistress for him ever to marry, even if the beloved had been free to consummate their relationship. In any case, the most frustrated of all his desires was for a boy. Psychobiographers have seized upon his struggle to win possession of his nephew, Karl, as proof that Beethoven was an incestuous homosexual. But Karl was his legal ward, and none of the evidence in court proceedings surrounding the boy's custody suggests an erotic charge to the relationship. Demonstrably and pathetically, Beethoven wanted a son to bear his name and inherit his fortune. The story of that 5-year litigation is an ugly one, and most of its ugliness derives from Beethoven's determination to win, no matter what pain it inflicted on the boy or on the boy's bewildered mother. Victorious at last, he sent Karl off to school, much as he dispatched a completed manuscript, and turned his furious energy on the Missa Solemnis. Listening to that work today, to the seraphic Benedictus, for example, with its violin solo floating like incense over the tenor melody, one is hard put to reconcile such tenderness with the fact that Beethoven was misanthropic and manipulative, greedy, quick to lie and cheat, so suspicious of other people's motives that he was prey to paranoid delusions. But then one has to take into contradictory account his often uproarious good humor and generosity, his Kantian ethics, his democratic pride, and the general conclusion among all who knew him and were hurt by him, that he was, beyond cliché, superhuman, with all the excesses that superhumanity implies: too much vigor, too much aggression, too much talent, and too little time to work them all off. In the event, he had to settle for 56 years. It was a life of prodigious labor, considering his natural gifts. When Beethoven improvised at the piano, he suppurated with melody. He could go on for hours, reducing his listeners to tears, while he, never a sentimentalist, eyed them with amused contempt. "Artists are fiery," he said. "They do not weep." Yet he lacked Mozart's ability to transfer perfection straight to paper as fast as the pen could fly. When forced to, he could compose quickly, but the results were often not good. Great music to him was a proper fusion of inspiration and industry, and industry implied the most logical improvement of every last structural detail. If he had to choose between the charm of a seductive tune and a figuration built out of integral coefficients, mathematical beauty won out every time. Oddly enough, arithmetic confused him. He never learned how to multiply or divide, and had such difficulty with simple household sums as to suggest dyslexia. Here and there in his letters, 14 comes out as 41, and 1808 as 1088. Yet again, contradictions abound when discussing Beethoven. He was a rationalist who took delight in solving almost impossible problems of counterpoint. The fugue that ends the Hammerkleiber Sonata takes a gigantic subject of 105 notes and proceeds to augment it, invert it, and even play it backward like a tape rewound, sometimes all three processes going at once, the musical equivalent of trigonometry. Such achievements put Beethoven in the same class as music's other ranking intellectuals, Bach, Brahms, and Webern, and yet none of these three could have written Fidelio. He had, besides, a mastery of musical architecture that was as instinctual as it was innovative. Again, the possibility of dyslexia arises. Some orthographically challenged people have an almost cubist ability to visualize planes and dimensions from many different angles at once. Beethoven's sound structures are full of disproportionate rooms and inner voids, with surprise changes of level and windows full of sky, but they always balance out as total buildings, no matter how large their size. Not for nothing was Beethoven the favorite composer of Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Kahn. The paradox of Beethoven's bigness is that it is not always measurable in time or decibels. He could and did compose symphonies and sonatas of unprecedented length, yet he was also a miniaturist. Some of his piano bagatelles, known as chips from the master's workshop, last little more than a minute. One is over in just 9 seconds. Chips they may be, but hold them up to the light and they glint with precious metal. Nor are they fragmentary in form. His spatial sense was microscopic as well as telescopic, With equal sureness, he built both cells and cathedrals of sound. The last bagatelle of Opus 119 is set in the same key as the Adagio of the Ninth Symphony, and it too is an endless flow of melody, rising to a serene height before resolving on the simplest of cadences. It spans just 22 measures to the symphony movement's 166. Yet for the short while it lasts, it seems, in Shelley's language, to stain the white radiance of eternity. Whoever chose to color the no less radiant whiteness of Harvard Yard with the fanfare after the big blizzard knew, as did the planners of Winston Churchill's funeral, or the witness to the fall of the Berlin Wall, that there are moments when only Beethoven will do. No other composer could have achieved so instant and so communal a reaction among young skiers, probably unable to name a single other of his works, if indeed they could even name him. Something bigger than personal identity, bigger than weather, bigger than mere melody and harmony, woke them to the promise of the morning and the strength of their bodies. The largest mind in musical history spoke to them in 1978, as it did when the boy Beethoven made his debut in Cologne 200 years before.